Good afternoon or morning or whatever it is where you're at. My name is Pastor Chad Roche. I'm a pastor and associate pastor at LifePoint Church in Santan Valley, where we typically have on Sundays after our church service a class or two or three based in apologetics or theology or something like that. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to come to you. I'm going to go through the third chapter of Norm Geisler and Frank Turek's book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. This is the book that we've been working through in the apologetics class that we have at our church. So I'm going to just put it out there. Anybody can watch this. You can read the book if you want. That's the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. I would encourage you to get it. It's a really good book no matter what, whether you're studying apologetics or not. So we're going to break down some arguments for God. This chapter is called In the Beginning There Was a Great Surge. So I don't stick to the book necessarily. Sometimes I deviate. I've got another book in front of me. And I have some other outlines and some paperwork with me that I'm going to teach from. So my thing with this is to equip Christians with the ability to discuss the arguments for God, that there is a God, and we can use science to help us prove God. And it's also a little bit of intent to, maybe if you're not a believer and you stumble upon this channel and you watch this, it should be something that equips you to know a little bit more about God. Now, the comments are going to be turned off for this video. I'm not interested in debating people about the content. I didn't write the book. I'm teaching it. I believe it. But there are definitely some people out there who think this is silliness, who think God doesn't exist and that science is all you need. But then we come into problems with the idea of what ought to be, what ought to happen. Science can always answer the question, why, where, how something happened, maybe even when something happened, maybe even where something happened. But what science can't do is answer the why. Why do these things happen? Now, Richard Dawkins is a really intelligent man, and the fact that he repeatedly over and over claims that asking the why question is ignorant, foolish, or childish, or just flat out stupid. I think he says actually it's a dumb question to ask the why question. He is literally telling each and every psychologist, sociologist, a lot of psychiatry, theologians, philosopher. He's literally telling that entire group of people that what they do is stupid. Now, I don't get that. I don't understand it. The why question in most people's lives is a foundational and fundamental question for most people. So I don't understand. But then again, what do I know? I'm just a college-educated pastor who believes in God, so I guess I'm dumb. Anyway. So today we're going to talk about surge. In the chapter, again, I don't stick to it. I have my own notes over here on my screen. So if you see my eyes wandering, I got the computer recording the equipment over here. And I got my computer and some notes all over the desk in front of me. My desk is like huge right now. So if you catch this channel, please watch our other shows. We're going to put it up on LifePoint's channel. We're going to put it up on LifePoint's page. But you can also catch us at that one show. It's Joe and I, Pastor Joe, our worship pastor, and I, talking about a lot of these same things, but this is more of a classroom instruction. So let's get right into it. So we're going to define some key terms today. And first of all, we're going to talk about the cosmological argument. So the cosmological argument for God is basically one of those arguments that we can use from science to say, no, there's just way too much evidence. There's too much reason and fact and evidence and truth out there to point to God actually existing. Now, it doesn't have to necessarily at this point be the God of Abraham. It doesn't have to be the Christian God. It doesn't have to be the Muslim God. It doesn't have to be any God specifically. At this point, we're talking about the general broad idea of divine design, whatnot. So what's interesting is I was watching, if you're a nerd like me, I've been watching Picard on CBS. It's the new Star Trek series. And what's interesting is the premise of the season thus far, warning, spoiler alerts, I have one episode left and I finished the season. And you can't binge it. It all comes out 1 week at a time. But anyway, the premise of this is that there's synthetic life that they've created, that humans have created, that has gotten to the point that it can mimic actual life. When you cut them open, they bleed blood, they have to sleep, they have to eat. It is literally the closest thing to creating life outside of the normal reproductive patterns. What's interesting is a lot of the arguments in there, and Gene Roddenberry was no Christian, as far as I know, but a lot of the arguments in there in the show do these people have life, and the farthest they've gotten to this point is they're this close to being able to do a transfer of consciousness, that you can transfer your consciousness to one of these artificial synthetic beings. Which, I mean, could that happen someday? I don't know. I don't know if God will allow that, but you can't transfer your soul without God's permission, or spirit. But anyway, beyond that. So, and the idea is that they can transfer this thing, and a lot of the comments in there, it's amazing. If you go watch the seventh or the second to last episode, is the one I watched last night. There was so much evidence for God in there. They have these synthetic beings that have digestive systems, that have all these mirror the same systems that humans have. They have personalities, which implies a soul. But over and over, there's comments about how miraculous it is, how there's first contact with these people, and they consider them persons. And there is so much argument in there that a Christian apologist or theologian watches these things, and then naturally my brain just goes to how quickly humankind would be to accept this kind of thing and you stumble upon it, and once you examine them or x-ray them, you'd see that they actually were not human, and that they're synthetic, that you would never, ever assume that those things just happened by a combination of time, matter, and chance. That if you give it enough time, these unbelievably complicated beings, they're fully synthetic, but they're unbelievably complicated, would just come into existence by themselves. It's a silly idea to begin with. Yet these same people who are standing on the science and religion for the most part throughout the entire Star Trek universe is looked down upon. Religion is, if it's fine for you, but anyway, there's no truth in it. Truth is only found in science. But the irony is, when they started exploring these synthetic beings, they're pretty much unpacking a lot of the arguments for God. I mean, for example, the planet where the beings live was essentially made by humans to over 200,000 years, and there's records of it. And they had to move 8 suns in a specific pattern and put a planet in the middle. And the characters acknowledge throughout the show that could not be done without a designer. They're saying that complicated of a solar system, that complicated of a planet aligning, and it couldn't be done. It had to. It's so obvious that it was done by a designer, which is hilarious, because that is literally the apologetic argument for us Christians, is saying, no, it's so obvious. Look around you. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to unpack some of these arguments that, again, if you go back and watch just the second to last episode of this show on CBS All Access, I think it's called, it's amazing. I mean, you can literally slot in God in all these different places. Anyway. So the first argument we're talking about is the cosmological argument. The argument that states because the universe had a beginning, it must have a cause. The cosmological argument says everything that it was created has a cause, right? And it comes from the Greek word cosmos, or cosmos, if you're going to use the proper Greek pronunciation, I think. I'm not fluent in Greek. My Greek knowledge is about that much. And so for every effect has a cause. It could be also determined that way, that these things all come into being, so that anything that was created or exists must have a cause. And not exist, I want to clarify that, because, we'll get there. But everything that is created has a cause. And so it comes from the first origins of the cosmological argument were in the writings of Plato. Plato lived from, let me check my thing here, 428 to 348 BC, and Aristotle was about 384 to 322. Aquinas wrote about it in Summa Theologica, which is a collection of Thomas Aquinas' writings that he actually should be referred to as Thomas of Aquinas, because Aquinas is not his last name, it's just where he was from. But anyway, so Aquinas wrote about this, And it says that Aquinas argues that in an infinite chain of finite causes is impossible. That if we have an infinite chain of finite things or causes, right? So a finite cause would be sexual reproduction, right? That's a finite cause. It's a one-time event. It happens. It creates life. It may create multiple lives, like twins or whatever. Or in the case of dogs, you have multiple puppies in a litter. But there's a finite cause that creates a finite thing. You cannot have an infinite chain of those. Eventually, there must have been a beginning, and there must be that beginning must be uncaused, is what he says. This is Thomas Aquinas in his writings. Now, obviously, the Christian, Aquinas being a Christian, argues that cause is, in fact, God. So, one objection to this, one major objection to this argument, the cosmological argument, is that if God exists, then therefore God must have had a cause, and that's why we have to be careful when we say the argument. I made this slip up just a few seconds ago. You have to be very, very careful when you make the argument about this, that you don't say that everything that exists has a cause, everything that was created has a cause, right? Because God is not created. Under the biblical worldview, God, and I believe it's also under the Quranic worldview, so the Islamic worldview, that the God was not created. He is eternal. He has always existed. Our pastor gave a great example one time of the difference between eternal and everlasting, right? An eternal being is something that has always existed and will always exist, whereas everlasting things, we have a point of creation from which point we can then exist forever. That thing can exist forever. So I apologize if you're watching closely. My eyes deviate. You're going to watch now. I have a little screen over to the right side of the camera. Anyway, my eyes deviate and bounce back and forth. I apologize if it's distracting, because it distracts me. So I will try my best not to do that. Anyway, so the detractors of this argument, or the arguments against this, say that no, this is not the case. There's another source of this argument. It's called the Kalam argument, and I have to pull up my notes on this real quick. Hold on one second. I forgot my keyboard on my MacBook broke, so I have to use a wireless keyboard over here. So anyway, so the idea is that it comes from a lot of constants. There's the Kalam constant, I think it's called. If you want more information on this, I think that there's a great resource called reasonablefaith.org. It's from Dr. William Lane Craig. Bill Craig he's the guy. I'm gonna call him Bill because I think I know him. We're good buddies. I've watched like all of his stuff. Very well recognized theologian and very, very well educated. So he talks about a Muslim theologian named Al-Ghazali, I'm sure I messed it up, which is in Iran, wrote a critique called The Incoherence of Philosophers, and he breaks down that there's all these arguments and it goes into these three steps. Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause of its beginning. So this is known as the Kalam argument. So it comes again from Al-Ghazali, so Al-Ghazali. I'll put it in the description below, and I'll put a link to this article and that I have. So basically this Muslim theologian is the one responsible for the Kalam argument, and Kalam, K-A-L-A-M, actually means, it is Arabic for eternal or everlasting, right? Same kind of word, I think. So what he's saying is, again, whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning. So whatever begins to exist has a cause. And again, this is very, very careful. This is a very nuanced argument, that it's not everything that was created, everything that begins to exist. So everlasting and eternal beings, or eternal beings rather, not everlasting, eternal beings don't begin to exist. They have always existed, and that would be God. So that is the cosmological argument. So another argument we're going to unpack and we're going to look at is the teleological argument. So the rooted word is in telos, which means in Greek, which means purpose. Sorry, brain fart there for a second. It means purpose or end, right? Telos meaning purpose. So that means that basically the idea that there's a hierarchy of design, that there's so many things that are designed. Thomas Aquinas again used a form of the argument called his cinque viae, I think is how you say it, which is the 5 ways, observing that there is an observable order in the universe amongst objects that cannot be attributed to objects themselves, but to an intelligent being. Right? This is the argument from purpose. This is one of my favorite arguments because in this argument, we're going to unpack a lot of things to do with fine-tuning. Right? We talk about how carefully the universe exists. Our planet, things like that, seems to be fine-tuned to extreme degrees. That if things are off, and we're talking about 10 to the 10th to the 72nd power, massive numbers, that the probability of these things not existing is you can basically call them impossible probabilistically. Is that a word? So, but the fine-tuning of the universe, one of those, for example, is the gravitational constant. The gravitational constant is something, mathematically, I think it's in physics, and I'm not a physicist, but in physics, the gravitational constant says that there's a constant in mathematics that says if this number deviates more than, and it's a very, very small deviation, that it can move, that either there isn't enough gravity and life will spread apart or separate indefinitely to the point where it can't be sustained, or it will be too strong, which will be crushed, right? So that there's this gravitational constant that has to be just perfect in order for things to exist. Under this one, there's also the idea that this is a big one where the Big Bang is actually a probable theory. I personally think that the Big Bang is highly plausible biblically, that when God spoke and said, "Let there be light," there was light. Well, what did that look like? A big giant bang of light that all of a sudden all of the materials and things needed for existence came into existence from the non-created, always eternal existing God. So, under these things, we have other arguments, and we'll get into the moral argument I have in front of me, which is a good argument, but the problem is here's the deal. So the moral argument is that everything within us, Dostoevsky, in his work, The Brothers Karamazov, I don't know how to say it. Anyway, so Dostoevsky writes, quote, "If there is no God, then everything is permissible. The unthinkable becomes thinkable. The forbidden becomes legal." So the moral argument says that there has to be a higher moral code in which all created things operate under, right? We're not just animals, because if we look at the animal kingdom is brutal. There is, for lack of a better term, wanton murder in the animal community, right? If you invade my territory, if I'm hungry, if you get too close to my family, I'm just going to kill you, right? That there's no moral judgment in that in the animal community, whereas in the human community, regardless of people's worldviews, atheists, regardless of their worldview, there is this inherent idea that certain things are just immoral, wrong, murder being one of them, rape, something like that. Now, this does not imply or mean that one must be a Christian or believe in God or be a theist or a deist, which is somebody who believes in God, to be moral. Right now, biblically, this is not the case at all, because we have a moral code. God says that He is written on our hearts, right? He knows us. He's written the knowledge of Him on our hearts. In Romans 1, He talks about making everything evident. It's all been made evident. We can all see it. It's all available to us. That we know these things inherently. That some things are just wrong, and we know this. And I could argue that. And Dawkins himself, Richard Dawkins, I'll look up his quote on the internet here in just a second, but his quote is that that's the truth to life, that it's there is no point to it, there is no purpose. He actually thinks this is a horrible argument. He thinks it's nonsensical. Well, he's wrong. We have a standard of morals that's written on our hearts that humans just inherently know. We know it's inherently wrong to eat your neighbor's baby. Now, that may seem like a crude example, but if you think of my previous example of going into nature, right? If we go into nature, eating somebody's baby may just be the way of things work. It might just be the circle of life. If a lion is chasing a herd of antelope and a baby gets left behind, it's going to eat the baby, right? So therefore, we can't just be, the moral argument says that we are just, we are moral beings. We know there's a good or a bad, right? And in fact, and I've seen this happen time and time again on internet debates, and it kind of frustrates me because it doesn't take a whole lot of thinking really to get to the point where you can say, the opposite argument is that, well, I don't need God's standard to know morality, which the apologist, we could then argue that you can't even use the words good or evil or knowing what is moral without stealing it from God. And in fact, that's another book that Frank Turek wrote, is Stealing from God, right? The atheist or the non-theist or the non-Christian must borrow from God terms that only can be defined by God. We cannot define as mankind what is good objectively. We can't do that without some standard from which to measure good or evil. We can't even say what is evil without what is saying what is good. We have to have a standard from which we can measure these things, right? Well, under a theistic worldview, whether it's Islam, Judaism, Christianity, whatever it is, we have a guiding principle. We have a guiding set of standards, rather, given to us by God, right? As a Christian, we have the Bible, we have Scripture that tells us this is the standards, what to live by. Now, under the Christian worldview, we have the free will to deviate from those standards with consequences, right? But the moral argument is a strong argument. I think a minute ago I said it wasn't, but it actually is. Once you unpack it, because to define an example, to push back or per se or argue, debate with a non-believer, or even some believers, to be honest with you. Most apologetics is practiced on believers. To say to them, if they say, well, you ask a question, how would you define evil? What is evil? What is bad? And if they say, well, it's what's illegal. Well, that's not true. The law can't tell us what is morally good or morally bad. Now, the law can make judgments based on what is morally good or morally bad, but the law can't tell us these things. Well, why? Well, look at the Americans, right? The Americans. Look at the United States of America. At one point in this country, and with many civilized countries or civilizations across the world throughout history, enslaving one another was not illegal. Was it morally wrong? Yes, it was objectively morally wrong. Why? Bible says so. Now, some people, I'll digress for just a second. Some people say, well, the Bible endorses slavery. No, it doesn't. Just because a newspaper reports something doesn't mean it endorses it. Just because a newspaper reports on a murder doesn't mean that the newspaper is endorsing murder. And just because God gives standards on how to treat other people who may or may not fall into the class of slaves does not mean he condones it. Now, and again, we also have to look at the different covenants. We have old covenants versus the new covenant, the New Testament. It would be unthinkable under the New Testament to come up with the idea that slavery was even close to being okay. And so I'm not going to unpack that in this episode, maybe a future episode of that one show. So anyway, back to the scientific argument. So we have the cosmological argument, or the Kalam argument, whatever came into existence has a beginning. The universe came into existence, therefore the universe has a beginning. It's not eternal. It hasn't always existed. Excuse me. Then we have the teleological argument, telos meaning purpose. So from the teleological argument, we can say that everything that has a purpose, that must exist. This can be known I completely lost my train of thought. The fine tuning, thank you. Thank you, my paper. The fine tuning of the universe, right? That everything has a purpose in this universe. That there is nothing without purpose. And everything that has a purpose tends to be very, very complicated and very, very intricate, including the universe itself. And then we move to the moral argument, which kind of originated with Immanuel Kant. So Immanuel Kant was a philosopher. There's some information, I think, in the book about him. 1724 to 1804 is when he lived. And he said, quote, there is, this isn't a quote, I'm apologizing, this is not a quote. This is a summation of what he says. There is a moral law which requires a universal lawgiver who is absolutely good, since the standard of good must be completely good. We have to have a complete and absolute standard of good by which to measure everything, including evil. Okay, so then we get into the ontological argument. The ontological argument says that there are a method of independent sense experience that relies on reason, right? God is something of which nothing greater can be thought, right? So this is one of the weaker arguments. It goes like this. God is by definition a necessary being. Existence is logically necessary as a concept of a necessary being. Therefore, God is a necessary being. He must exist. Geisler says this. The ontological argument can prove things about God's nature. For example, God must necessarily exist if he exists at all. He cannot cease to exist or can exist contingently. Okay? We're gonna breeze through that one because it's one of the weaker ones, and I don't want to focus on it. And so we're gonna get back to the chapter. I'm done with this quick section on those arguments. So we're about a half an hour in. We'll probably have another 15, maybe 20 minutes at this point. So bear with me. So we look at some of the fine-tuning of the world, right? We look at the cosmological argument and the ontological argument and the teleological argument together, and we combine the three and say, okay, and that will be an atheist. A lot of times the inclination will be to divide the three, and some theologians and apologists do the same thing. I would say we combine the three. If we look at the three together as evidence is comparable, that if one has to exist, the other, you know what I'm saying? If all three existed, then there's overwhelming proof. If two of the three, so look at all three of them collectively. We have that there needs to be an originating cause and a sustaining cause to the world. That there must have been a cause for something. Every effect has a cause. And if every effect has a cause, then those causes have purpose, and those things have purpose, right? Well, why? Because they're so fine-tuned, and everything is so intricately balanced. And if we were caused, and everything that exists has a cause, and those things that exist have purpose, well, what is that purpose? What ought those things do? That is the moral argument, right? So they walk hand in hand in hand. So again, the cosmological argument states that the universe has a beginning. So we have a law of causality, and we're going to unpack that a little bit, is a scientific law that states that everything that had a beginning had a cause. It is literally the law of cause and effect. Everything that had a beginning had a cause. I had a beginning. There's a cause for that beginning, right? I'm not going to unpack that one, but you guys know what it is. So if we break into some of the laws of thermodynamics, and if we're going to unpack the next 15, 20 minutes, I have to preface it with these things. So the first law of thermodynamics is that that the total amount of energy in the universe is constant, right? You may have heard this word that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, merely transferred. We might have learned that in high school, in physics or chemistry or biology in high school. But what we have to look at is anything in the law actually is better worded, that the scientific principle that states the total amount of energy in the universe is constant. That energy can neither be created nor destroyed, but what we know is empirical is that each energy is constant. It's kind of like a finite pie, I guess you could say. So that's the first law of thermodynamics. That's not that big of a deal when it comes to our arguments, but when I go into the second law, it's like, well, what's the first law? So the second law of thermodynamics, and this is where a lot of apologists land, is a scientific principle that the universe is running out of usable energy, and that nature as a whole is moving toward disorder rather than order. Now, this is a big deal when it comes to evolution, because evolutionists want to say that everything moves towards order, that if there was a creation point, then everything moves towards order. There was this big jumble of goo or stardust, whatever you want to call it, and at some point over enough time, it moved towards order. Well, the second law of thermodynamics says that's not the case. We have empirical, verifiable proof and evidence in our universe that things do not move towards order, they move toward disorder, the DNA. As we age, our DNA begins to break down, the proteins aren't as strong, etc., etc. If you want to know more about that kind of stuff, Dr. James Tour, Tour, is a fabulous speaker on... Wow, that was a sneeze. No, I do not have coronavirus. It was just a sneeze. It's dusty in here. So maybe we'll edit that out. I don't know. But Dr. James Tour is a phenomenal source for this. Tour is how you spell his name. Very, very common spelling. Is an amazing scientist. The law of entropy is a scientific law that states that without intervention, things tend to dissolve from order to disorder. This is an aspect of the second law of thermodynamics, right? So we have the law of entropy and the second law of thermodynamics, two laws of physics in science that say these are how the things work. These are not theories. These are not proposals. These are laws. So we can look at sometimes that they have certain constants. We talked about the gravitational constant. There's a cosmological constant. There's a whole list of constants. I don't have them all memorized. That we can go into to make arguments with science for a intelligent design. So we have the cosmic background radiation. This is remnant heat from the Big Bang explosion in the form of microwave radiation that has been subsequently stretched and cooled as the universe expanded. This is not a Christian thing. These are not ideas that are coming from the Bible. The Bible is not a scientific textbook. That's not what it is. So now I'm going to switch to the packet. If you don't have the book, I apologize. I have no way of getting this to you. So what? So what? That's actually the next section. So what? So what are we talking about here? If we have to prove the cosmological argument true, we have to say everything that had a beginning had a cause. Is that true? Now, a couple weeks ago in the class, face-to-face, we talked about how to examine the truth of a statement, right? That's basically what we're concerned with in apologetics. We're looking for our statements, our propositions that people make or say, are those true in and of themselves, right? So everything that had a beginning had a cause. That seems to be pretty empirically true. I mean, beyond a reasonable doubt, we can agree that everything that had a beginning had a cause. That just makes sense. We can see that happening. There is nothing in our known universe that we can see that exists that had a beginning that didn't have a cause before that. Anyway, so the premise too is the universe had a beginning. Right now, this one can get a little shaky because some people will debate that heavily, that the universe actually had a beginning. Some people hold that the universe is eternal. It's always existed. The problem is when we break down the law of entropy and the second law of thermodynamics, we get to an argument that says, based on the empirical and observable evidence we have in our world today, that cannot be true. It cannot have always existed. And there are plenty of scientists who agree with this. Albert Einstein himself didn't agree with that. That everything has always existed, right? That's not true. So then we can make a very nice observation about the universe that if everything had a beginning, that everything that had a beginning had a cause. The universe cannot be eternal because we have scientific and physical laws that say that's not the case. Therefore, the universe must have had a cause. A beginning, and therefore the universe must have had a cause, which we have to ask ourselves at this point, what was the cause? Now, again, Christian worldview, we say God. We can answer the when, the why, the how. The when and the how. Maybe we can talk about that kind of things. We can say, how did we get to this point scientifically? But again, we can't answer the why. The big why question is, why was the universe created? And science cannot answer this question, period. So the why of the creation of the world. So we look at, how do we know? Hubble himself, Edwin, I can't remember. Edwin, I was right the first time. Edwin Hubble observed the world or the universe expanding. He's observed these things. So what we're looking at, so once Hubble saw these things, from that point in 1948, the Big Bang theory came from Fred Hoyle. He was an atheist, shocker, and it was kind of derided. People kind of ignored him. They didn't like what he had to say. And he theorized that there would be remnant heat from that explosion. If that explosion happened, if the Big Bang had happened, there would still be, according to the laws of thermodynamics, the laws of entropy, physics, etc., there would be a remnant heat that still exists today. And nobody bothered to look for it. Until 1965, it was actually accidentally discovered, and it's called the cosmic background radiation. And what that basically means is if you think of an old TV, or even some newer TVs, or if you have a computer, sometimes when you power down the computer, the screen will still kind of glow for a few seconds, right? It's more common with older TVs. I think newer TVs are more energy efficient, so I don't see it as much. That's what we're talking about with the cosmic background radiation, is this idea that there's a remnant of heat out there, and two scientists actually at Bell Labs in Homedale, New Jersey, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, in 1965, discovered this radiation. Now, again, remember, truth is truth whether you believe it or know it or not. Truth is truth whether you know it or not. Truth is truth whether you believe it or not. It doesn't matter. So what we're looking at is this truth of cosmic background radiation, this remnant heat that exists in the world, in the universe rather, has always been there. Just because Penzias and Wilson discovered it, that doesn't mean they invented it. It doesn't mean that that it wasn't true before they discovered it. It means it was always there. We just hadn't found it yet. Again, Romans 1, God says, everything I've done is evident throughout creation. It's already there. You guys just got to go find it. And I'm going to give you equip you. God is going to equip us with the tools and the abilities to go find these things. Right? So why... All right, so we have the cosmic radiation, all these different things. I'm going through my packet here. We're going to wrap up here in about 10 minutes tops. There's a whole bunch of other theories in the book that we need to look at. And one I want to look at is and I apologize, my knowledge on this stuff is I'm just starting to learn a little bit about this stuff, but it's quantum physics, right? And there's a I'm not going to mention his name because, well, all right, Lawrence Krauss. He's a professor at ASU, and he's written a book about nothing. And he has gone on Colbert, and and we'll actually put a link to this video because I intended to show this video in class. That he goes off on this very long, very confusing, and he tends to be very academically arrogant in that basically he would say someone like me who went to a seminary and has a master's degree in theology that I don't know anything about what he's talking about, and I don't know much about it, truthfully, but I'm not stupid. I can kind of figure things out. Well, he basically shoots out and writes a book. He's a cosmologist and a quantum physicist, I believe. And quantum physics, from everything that I have read and everything that I can see, is theoretical. It's all theoretical. There may be some stuff in there that they've discovered that could be close to being true, but from everything that I've read, and I could be wrong, that quantum physics and quantum mechanics is all theoretical. So Krauss sets out in his book to talk about how to define nothing as actually not being nothing, that it is something, that there was this quantum vacuum that exists that burped out essentially particles, which eventually over time grew into creation. Now, again, the law of entropy says that's not even possible. That if that were the case, if there were this quantum vacuum, which still isn't nothing, it's something. If this quantum vacuum did exist and it did burp out the particles that are required for life, and that everything could have happened from that point, and maybe those particles bumped into each other enough times that the Big Bang happened, and then from that point, even if that happened, we have laws of physics that say that can't happen. That is moving towards order. That isn't possible. The law of entropy says no. We have observable situations and empirical evidence in our world today that things move toward disorder, not order. So, there's a lot of work in here that quantum uncertainty theory confuses causality with predictability. We may not be able to predict the movement of a subatomic particle, but that doesn't mean that the existence of the particle itself is uncaused. And so, again, going back to the Kalam argument, everything that exists, everything that came into existence must exist. A quantum vacuum cannot be eternal. How or why? And again, I don't, from memory, I don't think that Krauss explains that this even could be something in his book, that the quantum vacuums could have existed eternally. But at the end of the day, he's making an argument that is nothing. That is not nothing. An absence of something is not necessarily nothing, especially when you look at it in the frame of a quantum vacuum. It's still something. Something still exists. Something still happened. Because then you can ask yourself the very simple 3-year-old question, where did the quantum vacuum come from? Right? I mean, we have to look at that. And then he ignores all of the philosophical arguments, and a lot of these arguments can be debunked. And again, William Lane Craig is a great author. James Tour is a great author. And these guys, Stephen Myers, these are all great, very, very intelligent men. Tour and Myers being scientists, have gone into this and said, no, if we look at science, this isn't even possible. This isn't even probable that these things could work this way. And Tour actually unpacks one of the reasons that this couldn't be happening, because what he says is, if time and chance and matter were enough to create life into order, again, law of entropy says that can't happen, but if he says, okay, if that was the case, it is improbable that it would happen, right? He walks through these arguments that he created these little nano machines, essentially, and in the process of creating these nano machines, that they would get to a certain point, and if something was wrong, so it was essentially a living thing, right? It's close to it enough that in the process of this creation, they get to a certain point that if there is an error, they can't just correct that error and move forward. It destroyed the machine. What they have to do is they have to go back to the beginning, correct the error, and start over. Well, folks, the universe could not have done that, according to James Tour. This is not my opinion. This is an opinion of a very, very smart, intelligent scientist. That the universe could not have done that. What would have to happen every single time there was an error or a problem or something that didn't work in the universe to make it what it is today. So we look at the fine-tuning argument, right? The teleological argument purpose. If we look at the fine-tuning of the world and the fine-tuning of the universe, that if one of those things were just a little bit off, creation would have had to have gone back to the beginning and started all over again. That would have had to destroy everything that existed at that point and start over again. Not even God himself did that. When God destroyed the world in the flood, he didn't destroy everything. He left the ark with Noah and his family, 8 people, and all the animals that were on there, right? No doubt there were bacteria, there were fungi, there were probably viruses, there were probably parasites, there were yeast. I'm sure all those things existed on the ark, whether naturally occurring or they were brought on by animals or whatever. So not even God starts over and destroys everything. He didn't do that. So that's what Tour says, is that's one of the arguments that there's this idea that this evolutionary process just happened is nonsense. And what frustrates me about schools is they won't even talk about intelligent design. They won't even bring up the conversation, even though you don't have to mention God. You do not have to talk about the Christian God. You do not have to proselytize. You don't have to talk about any God specifically. What we have to do, and what you can do very logically and very reasonably, is present an argument that there is intelligent design behind the things that we have in this world and our universe. All right, let's move back to the text. I'm gonna take from Frank Turek's actual arguments and say, how old is the universe? The age of the universe. When was the world created? How old is the universe? I'm going to use Frank Turek's exact line. The only thing I know is that it's at least 41 years old, right? I'm 41, right? It's at least 41 years old because I know that I have existed for that long. Before that, I don't really know. Could it be 6,000 years old? Absolutely. Could it be, I forgot the number. It's like 800 billion years. I forgot the number. Sure. I think very clearly we see in Scripture, I'm going to pull it up if you want to grab your Bible. I'm going to go to Genesis 1, right? Really hard to find. That if you go in Genesis 1, in any of the translations out there, you can read, I'm reading from the NIV. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." Stop right there. Between verse 1 and verse 3, we have no idea how much time went past. Again, verse 1 to verse 3, we have no idea how much time passed. In the beginning, that's the beginning of time for us. It's not the beginning of time for God. So in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was all over it. There was no light. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. So he obviously made this earth with just water to begin with, which makes sense because we're mostly water. But between the time that he created the heavens and the earth and how Moses in here explains what the earth looked like at this point, we have no idea how much time took place. Could it have been a trillion years? It sure could have. Why not? To God, an hour is a day is an hour. It means nothing to him. Time, he is outside the confines of time. It means nothing. So my personal opinion is, how old is the world? We have no idea. I don't know. There's flaws in radioactive carbon dating, I guess. Again, not a physicist, not an anthropologist or anything, but there's flaws with that kind of dating. So I don't know. Biblically, sure, it could be 6,000 years from the descriptions here when God said, "Let there be light." If you backtrack it, I guess people have done this, that could be 6,000 years, probably, maybe, I don't know, biblically. But before that point, we have no idea how much time transpired. No idea whatsoever. So, I think I've covered everything at this point. I'm going to go back to my notes real quick. Again, I think we could argue from the intelligent design standpoint, why is the origin of life, why is this such a big deal? Why is this study such a big deal? Well, contrary to what Richard Dawkins says, the why actually is a legitimate question, right? That's why it is a big deal. You can unpack the surge. You can Google it. Frank Turek's surge videos. You can Google his stuff all day long. When he talks about surge being an acronym, the second law of thermodynamics, the universe is expanding, radiation from the Big Bang, great galaxy seeds. I didn't really unpack this one. Astronomers have found evidence of ideal amount of variation in cosmic background radiation to form galaxies, which supports the Big Bang theory that the universe had a beginning. And finally, he talks about the E in surge is Einstein's theory of general relativity, which has been mathematically proven. It supports the idea that the universe had an absolute beginning. Again, like I said, not even Einstein believes that the universe was eternal or is eternal. So that's going to wrap it up for some of our discussions about the beginning of the world and how intelligent design is actually, obviously in my opinion, a stronger argument for the existence of things. Again, you don't have to at this point accept the Christian God or any theistic God for that point, but what you do have to accept is that seems to be an inordinate amount of order and purpose in the world, and that there isn't randomness. And if that were the case, and there is no moral law and there is no moral lawgiver, then there can be no objection that anything is evil. Thanks for tuning in. I hope this was informative. Again, comments are turned off. If you know how to get a hold of me, please do let me know. Give me some feedback. If not, next week I will try to do the same thing. Take care. Oh, no. All right. Well, thanks. I hope this was informative to you. Next week, I will do the same thing. We'll catch up on chapter 4 in the Geisler and Turek book. And let me see what chapter 4 is. I've read it, but I forgot off the top of my head what it is. Bear with me. Divine design. So we're going to go back into a little bit. We're going to unpack some of the James Tour stuff, which quote from James Tour right here in the book says, "Only a rookie who knows nothing about science would say science takes away from faith. If you really study science, it will bring you closer to God." Cool. I hope you had fun. I surely did. If you want to get a hold of me, you know how. Please do. If not, I will see you next Sunday for a little bit more apologetics and theology. Take care.